Hey, what's up? I'm Channel Pup, fanboy supervillain. Everybody has their opinions on how Sonic should control, often based upon their favorite games in the series or what they grew up with, what they understand to be the core appeal of Sonic the Hedgehog gameplay. And with the most recent mainline Sonic title, Sonic Frontiers, Sonic Team clearly have versatility in mind for Sonic. How many more times am I going to say Sonic in this one single paragraph? It's a lot. They made it clear, though, that they want to go bigger, have a Sonic that can control well in a variety of different platforming instances, as well as a fun combat system beyond just bonking enemies on the head. And I think that's a great direction to start moving things. From what I can gather, the next Sonic game is in the works right now over at Sega, and is set to be a continuation of this formula. But I still think there's a lot more work that needs to be done before we can just go taking this gameplay style and build a brand new game on top of it. And with the news of Sega expanding Sonic Team across all major regions, I have ideas for how we could put this newfound manpower to work. However, I am going to try to avoid basing this on personal preference so much as perfecting the groundwork laid down by Sonic Frontiers, respecting the original vision of the gameplay style while discussing how to make it that bit more dynamic. It does just so happen that this would also kind of be my ideal Sonic playstyle. So sit back, relax, subscribe, Patreon, you know how this works. Let's get started. Number 1. Migrate from Hedgehog Engine 2. Hedgehog Engine 2 is over 5 years old now. It's a last-gen engine. Moving on from Hedgehog Engine 2 is overdue at this point. Now, I've spoken at length about how ugly of a game Sonic Frontiers is, with visual issues breaking immersion constantly plaguing the whole experience. It's something I can get used to, sure, but hey, us humans can get used to all kinds of inconveniences. That doesn't mean I want to pay a full price tag for it. Trouble is, even if Hedgehog Engine 2 really is as robust as Iizuka claims, given that it is a purely in-house engine, this gives Sega a bit of a problem. Sonic Team has a revolving door of talent, and allegedly there's a big investment boom happening at Sonic Team as they'll be bringing in new employees from around the world. So the problem with working on an in-house engine is that a lot of time and money needs to be spent on familiarizing that team with such a specific engine. According to Takashi Iizuka, the reason Hedgehog Engine was the go-to for as long as it was because it could handle the speed of Sonic gameplay. But there's enough evidence to prove that other engines are just as capable, if not more so. Now, the dream would be Unreal Engine 5 or 4, and we could get a gorgeous, cinematic-looking Sonic experience. However, we do have one slight problem: the Nintendo Switch. Unfortunately, Unreal 5 does not work on the Nintendo Switch, and Unreal 4 has a reputation for being very janky on the Switch. Sonic games tend to sell their best on Nintendo consoles, so I can understand why Sega wouldn't want to focus purely on Sonic games as a next-gen experience, all the while Nintendo are just making last-gen hardware. But there is one engine that Sonic Team and associates of Sonic Team who have worked on the Sonic franchise have used: Unity Engine. With Sonic Superstars, all of the code of Evening Star's Star Engine, formerly known as Retro Engine, the engine used to create Sonic Mania and the Sonic Origins remakes, was translated over to Unity for the production of Sonic Superstars. Not only that, Sega Hardlight Studios commonly work with Unity Engine. Both Sonic Dash and Sonic Dream Team run on Unity. Now, of course, all the games I've mentioned there are either mobile games or retro throwbacks. However, Unity can achieve photorealism if that's what they want to go for. However, I personally would advise moving away from photorealism in favor of something stylized. With Unity, even if Sonic Team aren't able to migrate much of Sonic Frontiers' code over, there are excellent foundations to work with between Sonic Dream Team and Sonic Superstars, purely for the movement and physics, which are the most important part of any Sonic game. But okay, for part 2, we're going to be looking at 2 options for Sonic's movement. Starting with option A, which is to polish up the existing movement of Sonic Frontiers and bring that forward into the next game. So, I want to start by talking about some general movement fixes. There are some pretty egregious problems with Sonic Frontiers' physics that need addressing. I think it's important that I should always be able to trust the physics of the game. To trust that if I fling myself off of a slope, I will actually fling off the slope and won't just magnetize to the side and plummet face first into the ground or bottomless pit below. This isn't too much of a common occurrence in Sonic Frontiers. My understanding is that if the slope is curved at the end and I'm on foot, Sonic will generally cling to that, while if I spin dash, he'll treat it as a fling ramp. But there are occasions where Sonic just can't quite decide what he wants to do, so I'll prep myself for a sick jump only to eat shit. Trusting in the controls and physics of the game to be consistent is important to any game, like, at all, but especially one with a movement focus like Sonic. Then there's how Sonic interacts with rough terrains. He's shaken all over the place, as is the camera, and it just looks rough. Even on cobbly terrains, Sonic should be able to kind of glide along them. This is more a matter of setting the IKs on the terrain objects to smooth, if I understand correctly, but this would go such a long way towards making the game just feel better and less amateurish. Quite a major problem this game has is locking off abilities after a single use while in air. If I have air dashed once while in the air, it doesn't matter if I homing attack an enemy, the air dash is now off limits to me. This made one of the cyberspace stages in the Final Horizon DLC an absolute pain in the ass. An instance where I'm very much in air, there's lots of enemies present, and the platforms are a little distance away from me, but even though I've just done a homing attack, because I air boosted before that homing attack, I just can't do it now. I'm not saying that the air dash should be spammable, but if I air dash up to an enemy, then homing attack them, that should reset my ability to air dash. A similar thing goes for the stomp as well. If I stomp, and then I cancel the stomp with an air dash, I can no longer stomp again, and I don't understand why. Another super egregious issue is the turn radius on Sonic while jumping. When jumping, Sonic should instantly face in the direction of the analog stick, rather than having to rotate himself in a circle. It shouldn't be this cumbersome to align yourself while jumping in a platform game. And then finally, being able to walk around a loop or directly up a vertical incline is unacceptable. The friction needs to be way lower. The physics are what defined this franchise back in the 90s. To lose sight of that this hard is just embarrassing. I'm now going to talk a bit about the slider system and why it has to go. Sonic Frontiers is like a Sonic game made by Subway. You have it your way, which I thought was Burger King's slogan, but Garrulous64 insists otherwise. I want an entire episode based on whatever you're eating.
It was a Subway sandwich. It was a foot-long steak, cheese, pepper, onion thing.
Salty, you ever eat Subway?
Yeah, I ate Subway. I think I was in high school.
What's like your go-to sub?
Oh god, I'm gonna get freaking flamed for this. I'm gonna get some buffalo chicken and just some cheese on it, and I'm good. I had it once, and I thought it was kind of good, so after that point, every time I went, I would probably just get that.
I don't really think that's necessarily that weird. Just like a buffalo chicken melt, that sounds pretty good. Yeah. My old one, I really took Have It Your Way at Subway as like a challenge, and I would do tuna, pepperoni, and onions.
Okay, what is wrong with you?
It was good, I swear to God. I swear it was good.
Wait, can you repeat that again? I need to, like, fully process what you just said.
That's what they say at Subway, to have it your way. So I did.
That's not what they say. That's Burger King. Subway's thing is eat fresh. Burger King is have it your way.
I said that Subway the other day in front of people, and they agreed with me.
Now, it's worth noting that while Sonic Frontiers was more popular than not, it was also a fairly divisive game. Then look at the Final Horizon DLC, which got a bit more ambitious with the platforming, which is a good thing, yet it was even more divisive. And I think that might be partly down to the fact that I actually went in and really played with these sliders to get a gameplay style that would just make it fun to run around. But not everyone is necessarily as fascinated by those sliders as I am. Some people would rather just pick up and play the game as it was intended. Movement is the single most important part of any Sonic game, and yet so much of the movement is left up to the player's choice, which means that you can jump into the world of Sonic Frontiers with the most boring playstyle known to man, and quickly tire of it because it just isn't thrilling enough. In the main game of Sonic Frontiers, a lot of the platforming elements are helped along by automation, be it via dash pads, rails, or homing attack chains. They've certainly done a better job at disguising the automation than they did with, say, Sonic Forces, where they just rip control away from the player for like 20 seconds of a 1-minute level, but it did mean that these platforming sections weren't particularly inspiring. And this was done to accommodate for the many different playstyles that people might choose in this game. Then we move over to Final Horizon, where those automated elements were drastically reduced in favor of ambitious platforming with ramps and floating blocks all in 3D, and you'd think that would be perfect. And while I had a great time with it, I didn't quite twig how utterly unintuitive this would be with the wrong setup. Even in the base game, not the Final Horizon DLC, there are some pretty rudimentary instances of platforming that can be made utterly unintuitive with the wrong setup. There are, of course, the two base gameplay styles of action mode and high speed mode that work as kinda a one-size-fits-all gameplay style, but the player definitely shouldn't be able to bust this game quite so wide open to the point that it doesn't function correctly anymore just by playing with sliders. I don't think there's anyone that wants to tailor the experience themselves only to constantly have to keep busting the menu open to tweak things for specific challenges. You can make Sonic absurdly slow. You can make him zippy fast, but with absolutely no sense of inertia, meaning it's a pretty intangible, thrill-less experience. You can make his turning feel less responsive, because less responsive is a pretty handy-dandy option. And because the game is trying to account for all these different potential playstyles, it has to lean on automation more than it really should, meaning that many of these platforming sections are pretty uninteresting to actually play. The solution is to have one playstyle that the game is built on top of. But of course, I do want to take into account accessibility. Sega wants Sonic to be for everyone, which I fully understand. So I'm going to approach this on a slider-by-slider basis and suggest some overhauls. I'm going to try to keep this mostly objective, but I know that when it comes to the final outcome, personal preference is absolutely going to be a factor. But to be clear, I don't need Sonic to be just one thing. I just want movement to feel good, for it to be thrilling, and for it to make logical sense. So let's take a look at these sliders. Starting speed is one that I immediately changed down to 0. A gradual buildup of speed makes Sonic more controllable, but it also makes the feeling of reaching top speed more satisfying. Personally, I'd say put it down to 0 and ditch this option. Same goes for initial boost speed as well. If Sonic just immediately starts moving at top speed, there's no sense of momentum or drag to it, so it doesn't feel very satisfying. Momentum defined this character back in the 90s. Top speed shouldn't be instantaneous, so I would say remove these sliders and have 0 be the default. Turning speed, boost turning speed, and steering sensitivity. Again, there's a bit too much choice here for newcomers. But for a game that requires some versatility in movement, including precise platforming, like Sonic Frontiers, tight turning circles need to be possible for players, and this needs to be up nice and high if we're not provided with the option to drift. So I would absolutely say ditch all 3 of these sliders that would basically do the same thing, and just have the steering all the way up. It needs to feel nice and responsive. Sonic isn't a car. He should always be able to turn. Bounce height is the single most bizarre slider on here. So Sonic has a bounce move, but bounce height has nothing to do with that. Bounce height is the gravity, how far Sonic will fling when running off of a ramp. The game requires the bounce height to be turned up at least somewhat, otherwise some of the platforming challenges are utterly unintuitive. This one just makes no sense, nix it. Jump deacceleration was added in later, after criticism of the jump killing Sonic's speed. Jumping should not cause Sonic to deaccelerate. Can you imagine how different the response to the classics would have been if jumping always killed Sonic's speed? I don't think we'd have a Sonic 2, 3, Adventure, and so on. So nix that, turn jump deacceleration off entirely, and nix the option. On foot deacceleration is a weird one. So by default, this is turned up entirely to 100, and what this does is serve as an instant brake for Sonic, meaning that no matter how fast you're moving, Sonic will instantly come to a complete stop the second you stop pushing forward on the analog stick. Think Sonic 4 Episode 1. Now, I personally do not like the idea of Sonic automatically stopping on a dime just because I stopped holding forward. There's a joy in just letting Sonic coast down an incline. It's like riding a bicycle when you're rolling downhill and you just take your feet off the pedals, and you're just gliding fancy-free. It feels good! It's that philosophy which makes rolling in the classic and adventure games so satisfying. The problem here is that Frontiers was undeniably designed around the auto brake, and turned down too far, Sonic feels way too sensitive. You just try to turn him around to face another direction and he'll walk like a meter. Sonic Frontiers has various instances that require precise movement, such as panel puzzles and these fucking boxes in one of the Final Horizon cyberspace stages. The deceleration rate should be determined by how fast Sonic is moving, meaning that, yeah, he can stop on a dime if he's just walking, but if he's moving at top speed, then it takes a little more work to get him to slow down. I feel like a good solution to this would be a brake option. Maybe clicking down on the left analog stick causes Sonic to brake, or maybe L1 or R1. The reason I say this is because when on ground, that serves purely as the quick step, which is rendered pretty much useless outside of the squid boss fights, and even then, you can simply use the analog stick there. Maybe have L1 for the dodge and R1 for the brake. Either way, I don't think this should necessarily be a slider. I think the deacceleration rate should be influenced purely by the speed at which Sonic is moving, and not by a slider. So yeah, nix that. Maintaining boost during a jump, again, I don't see why you wouldn't want that, so nix that. Lastly, acceleration and top speed. These are the ones I don't think they should nix. I think they should be reworked into an accessibility option. Rather than these being sliders, you are given the option of a slow and steady mode for newcomers or people with disabilities. This drastically reduces Sonic's top speed, making him more manageable, but unlike the sliders, places down automated elements such as dash pads and dash ramps in their place, meaning that all of the platforming sections are possible. Whereas with this mode switched off, the platforming's a bit like how it is in Final Horizon when on hard mode, with less of the automated elements. What you'd end up with is the same general playstyle, but you'd have a Sonic with a gradual build of speed, tight responsive turning, carries all of his speed into his jumps, and his deacceleration speed is influenced entirely by the speed at which he's going. And then newcomers have the option of reducing his top speed, but with toggled concessions made in the level design to account for the lower speed, which is something Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon kind of flirts with in its normal and easy modes, minus the changes to Sonic speed. So sure, I initially loved the idea of sliders, the idea of tailoring Sonic's controls to my preferences, but I don't want that to come at the expense of interesting level design and overall game quality. We, the players, are not the designers here. It should be just up to us to enjoy what they've made for us. So no sliders, just a great base gameplay style that gives you speed and responsive turning, with the option of a sort of kid mode that will allow you to play the game at a lower speed, but with a helping hand along the way from the level design. That was option A. Option B is to use different foundations for Sonic's movement and go scorched earth on Sonic Frontiers. I, like many, have criticized Sega for throwing out the baby with the bathwater. By which I mean they could have a game that's got lots of potential, a great gameplay style, but because the game didn't review very well for other reasons, they just throw out the whole thing and start all over again rather than refining it. But in this case, I'm not saying throw everything out, I'm saying to use a different existing foundation. Hear me out. I already suggested making Sonic games in Unity going forward, and with that, Sonic Team would have access to a movement system fans have dreamt of for decades. With Sonic Superstars, Sonic Team, Evening Star, and Arzest were finally able to get authentic, classic-style Sonic movement working in a 3D space. Rather than using the existing foundations of Sonic's open zone movement from Frontiers, more dynamic gameplay could be achieved by integrating the movement system of Sonic Superstars and then integrating or replicating the combat system of Sonic Frontiers on top of that. Morio Kishimoto has stated on Twitter that he wants to explore more momentum-based gameplay for future projects. Why spend ages making an imitation of that gameplay style when you can have the real thing? But of course it would need some tweaks, I get that. Nice tight turning just like in Sonic Frontiers. Obviously you'd want the bounce move, the homing attack, maybe the double jump, but there's one more fairly important element. Sonic Frontiers technically has a boost mechanic, but it doesn't work in the conventional way, serving less as the reward of unstoppable spectacle, more as a simple run button. Without boosting, Sonic is locked to a basic jog, and this is handy for certain platforming sections. It makes for a more versatile Sonic, which allows these open zones to be packed with unique activities. With that being said, I think we can go a little further when it comes to perfecting this mechanic. So let's talk boosting. Sonic's boost in Sonic Frontiers is for the most part finite. You get a little gauge that runs out and refills after a brief cooldown period. The thing is, I don't understand why it's finite in Sonic Frontiers. The boost is integral to gameplay as the air dash is required for certain platforming sections, and it is the sole source of speed in this game. It doesn't have offensive capabilities, nor is it as unwieldy and bullet-like as it is in previous entries, so there's no real reason to limit this. Not to mention, you can upgrade your boost gauge to the point where the limit is negligible, and very easily gain infinite boost by using the side loop. With boosting serving purely as a basic speed button, while Sonic's default pace is a brisk jog, there's not really any need to limit this function anymore. Plus, the boost gauge looks fuck ugly when it's in the middle of the screen, and I wish we could just put it back in the left corner if we absolutely must have it. But I have an alternative idea of how Sonic Superstars' movement system can be integrated into an inverted version of the Frontiers boost system. Rather than achieving speed by holding down a button, let's make a continual increase of Sonic's speed the default state. So you can traverse normally with your speed uncapped, but when you hold down the right trigger, Sonic slows down to a much more controlled pace. This would allow the player to quickly slow down, and all the while the trigger is held, Sonic will move at a capped pace. Think of it more as switching gears. Rather than this being a run button, it's a slow button basically, because you're gonna be going fast more often than not. That should be the goal. Now, there is one move in Sonic Frontiers which is almost completely redundant, utterly unnecessary, and that is the slide move, which is assigned to the B or circle button. I cannot think of a time in Sonic Frontiers where I ever needed to slide. So, here's my proposal. Replace the slide move with rolling. Just rolling, not the spin dash, just rolling. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of joy to simply coasting along near effortlessly after building up lots of speed. It's the speed reward philosophy. And then you can, roll into enemies, do what the top speed can't. Now, as for the spin dash, have it activated by holding down the B or circle button while mashing the left trigger like we have in the original Sonic Frontiers. But rather than the spin dash giving you a continuous acceleration like it does in Frontiers, have it operate the way it does in the classics. Just a quick burst of intense momentum. Now, I did get thinking a lot about how much I love weaving along the hilly terrain using the spin dash and using it to cover a great deal of ground. Being able to skip complex platforming with a well-positioned spin dash is, to me, what Sonic is all about. You're rewarded for using Sonic's power. Well, this could probably be built into the level design. Rather than the spin dash launching you into the air with the slightest incline, have more ramps that would naturally launch a spin dashing Sonic into the air built into the levels. So rather than exploiting some wonky geometry, getting airtime and using your speed to bypass tricky platforming feels a bit more deliberate and sure-footed. And tying in with the spin dash, I want to factor in visual feedback a little bit. When rolling into enemies in Sonic Frontiers, there's a brief lag and the enemies effectively explode on the spot. Personally, I think it's much more thrilling to see the enemies get knocked back a great distance by the impact, rather than the impact slowing us down. Part of what made boosting in Sonic Unleashed feel so powerful was watching enemies get hurled off into the distance by Sonic's powerful speed. It would be incredible to see this make a comeback via rolling. Perhaps have the distance the enemies fly influenced by how fast Sonic is moving. Physics. So that was part 2, my 2 options on the general movement and what they can do. Which do you prefer here? Option A of perfecting the existing Frontiers playstyle, or option B of integrating Sonic Superstars' movement system, and then building things like combat on top of that? Comment below, because now we're moving on to part 3, combat. I love the combat in Sonic Frontiers. Sonic feels powerful. Too powerful. When some moves deal consistently more damage than others, it can be tempting to just spam those moves, and there's no incentive not to. For example, the stomp. You might as well just stomp repeatedly and you'll chomp away at the enemy's health. It means that other moves end up as little more than just visual stunts, and artistry in combat ends up entirely voluntary. Now, I will say, there's certainly a place for that in an accessibility toggle. You could check a little box that says simplified combos, and that combat functions just like the original Sonic Frontiers, where you can have as much or as little flair in your fighting as you please. But I think for the sake of making the combat that bit more engaging, I'd say make it so the more you spam one move, the less damage it does, and that you deal much more damage through chaining combos together. So sure, I could deal a great deal of damage on Giganto with a single stomp, but after 2 consecutive stomps, he builds up a little resistance to it, and it does less damage, until I include some other moves into the mix. I'd also say dial up the input on some of these combos too. When doing the Wild Rush, perhaps have a QTE that requires me to move my analog stick in different directions, so I feel like I am the one controlling Sonic's ziggy-zaggy motion. While doing the Spin Slash or Cyclone Kick, have the move do significantly more damage or last longer if I rotate or wiggle the analog stick. You could have on-screen prompts to suggest this early in the game and tutorials accessible from the menu. It just gives the player that little bit more agency. Then for the parry. Obviously, Final Horizon experimented with the parry quite a bit. The hard mode perfect parry works really well in boss fights like Giganto and The End, but not so much with, say, Wyvern or Knight. It's just not versatile enough to work with enemies that have lengthy wind-up animations and no last-minute visual tells. I'd say the perfect version of the parry is the perfect parry on normal mode where you are given 1 second to parry. It is just long enough to give a little teeny tiny bit of leeway on wind-up times, but short enough to make fights feel that bit more intense. There's really no need for this to ever be a whole 15 seconds. 4 seconds tops as an accessibility option. One more thing, invincibility frames. They are vital in any game with a combat focus, especially with enemies that can shoot projectiles. The amount of times I just get pummeled by this tower. Give me a second to get up, damn it! And that finally brings us over to number 4. Other playable characters. For the most part, I do like what the different playable characters brought to the table in Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon, but I think these definitely need a lot of work if they are to become a part of the main game next time, which I really hope they will. For starters, I think they need some more combo moves, especially Knuckles. He should have a number of combos either equal to or greater than Sonic, but certainly not less. For Tails and Amy, as long as they're able to hold their own against enemies, I'm fine with what they have now, as they are less combat-centric characters. Across the board though, I think we need to remove the max ring bonus moves. I'd say make them toggleable, but honestly I'd go further and say nix them entirely. Their on-foot controls feel a lot better when the rings aren't maxed out, but okay, I will go through them one by one and explain why they need to go. Starting with Knuckles, whose max ring moves are probably the least offensive. Knuckles being able to glide without losing altitude is far too exploitable, and then there's his drill boost, and just... why would I want to run around as Knuckles, but now he looks like a fucking spinning top? Sure, it has offensive capability, but it's super situational, and I'd rather just run around as normal, so nix it. Amy's max ring move is pretty egregious. When she's maxed out, again, rather than her classic run, she instead hops onto her hammer, creating a big wheel made of cards, which controls more like a car. This actively makes her more difficult to control. While drifting is satisfying, because the terrain in Frontiers is so uneven, you'll often find yourself flying above the ground, and rather than drifting, you'll just default into a stomp. This is bad enough as is, but worse yet, this also nerfs your air boost with a significantly reduced range. And even worse yet, there's like a 2-second wind-up animation that kills the pace entirely. Get rid. And then there's Tails, who gets it the worst. My god. So look, as a Sonic Adventure 2 fan, yes, I'm happy to see the Cyclone, but this ain't it. This really, really ain't it. I'm aware that part of the appeal of playing as Tails is just looking at all of the platforming challenges ahead and saying, nah, I'm good, and then just flying over them. But this is just ridiculous. Your basic ground movement is sacrificed for an incredibly unwieldy tornado cyclone mech that moves at top speed at all times. It does not stick to the ground, and there's not really any height limit either, meaning that you can literally go anywhere without limitation. Sure, it deactivates when your boost gauge runs out, but remember, you've got incredibly easy access to an infinite boost. The laser is also just... well, it's just utterly useless in combat, as there's so much wind-up time that by the time you're done winding up, you've already been hit, and you have to be on the ground standing still to even use it. The only time it's of any use is destroying shielded boxes, which is incredibly situational to the point it would just be easier to remove the shielded box challenges entirely. The Cyclone is just too exploitable, and it severs access to your base movement. Absolutely get rid of it. I'd love to see the Cyclone represented, but not like this. Give it some individual missions where it plays more like it did in Sonic Adventure 2, maybe with environmental damage to make it that much more satisfying. Getting back to Amy, I honestly love her playstyle in Frontiers. How her heightened jump, glide, and bounce can make quick work of platforming sections, allowing for a ton of unique vertical challenges to accommodate for her. This is a great playstyle. I guess my only complaint would be that there's too little use of her Pico Hammer during combat, but this could easily be beefed up with a few additional combo moves. She's easily my favorite character of the extended cast to play as. With Tails, it was an inspired choice making his combat purely ranged, and I'd love to see that expanded upon, with maybe a tailspin combo and other gadgets. The only thing I'm really not happy about here is the wind-up animation for his flight. Seriously, what is this game's obsession with wind-up animations? I have no idea why this is necessary. He can also gain infinite height by continually bouncing off of his charged wrench attack and flying upward. This ought to be fixed up in the future. His lack of homing attack isn't something I mind as long as he's able to easily attach to pulleys, which right now can be a little finicky. Then there's Knuckles, who is just the worst of the bunch. It feels like lately he is just destined to suck. Fortunately, the gliding has seen drastic improvements since the initial launch of Final Horizon, with a much better turning radius and a massively reduced wind-up animation, but there is still a lot of work that needs to be done here. I mentioned he could use some more combos, but the biggest problem is his climbing by far. For starters, Knuckles will not attach to a wall unless you push forward on the analog stick. He simply cannot glide into it. Then while on the wall, his climbing controls are incredibly sensitive, meaning that attaching to a wall doesn't feel sure-footed in the slightest, as Knuckles will immediately start climbing upward, or downward, whatever direction your camera is facing, and yeah, inverting the controls with the camera is just a mindfuck. Please don't do that. It makes it incredibly difficult to navigate. I appreciate that Knuckles climbs faster than Sonic, but I feel like his base speed is still too fast and slippery when on the wall. He's also much too sensitive in that if he so much as touches a non-climbable part of the wall while climbing, he falls down. And if he jumps while on a wall, rather than moving upward or simply detaching from the wall, he instead now pushes away from it. This, combined with the terrible jump turn radius, makes it incredibly difficult to reattach to a wall if you have detached from it. Now, assuming they fixed the jump turn radius, this would go a long way to mitigating this problem, but I don't think Knuckles should automatically jump away from the wall, and instead simply detach and reattach by gliding into it. Part 5. Absolutely no 2D gameplay. We have side-scrolling Sonic games. Let's keep those as the side-scrollers and let the 3D ones be 3D. And that's about it. Those are my ideas for what I think they should implement and change with the Sonic Frontiers gameplay style before building that next game around it. Maybe I'm too late, or maybe someone at Sonic Team or Sega of America or something, someone who speaks English, is actually listening to this and can maybe translate it and pass it on to the team. I don't know. Super unlikely. But what do you guys think? What do you think of my suggestions? What do you think needs to change? Comment below and discuss. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, be sure to hit subscribe, hit the like button, and in the description below is the link to my Patreon page, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get exclusive updates to my Sonic fan project, Speeding Ticket, a Sonic adventure. It's a short fan film, fully animated, and have your name in the credits of these videos, with a special shout out going to the patrons in the $5 and above tier. We have RT0, Wilma, CalX, Hypes, Glad Goku, Daredenny, SSS06, Kale Bennett, Ken K, Dazzle Fizzle, Hypermecha SP, Cirrus the Skeptic, Biotin. Oh no, I've used up all the helium. What am I meant to do now? And Vera Wild. Thank you folks so much for your generosity, and to all of you at home, thank you so much for watching, and have a good day. Now get out of here, you big idiot.